Hello, everybody. This is Jan Rutherford. Hey, thanks for joining us today. We've got a short 20-minute webinar scheduled for you today, and then we'll take some questions. And of course, we'll be recording this, so if you miss a part of it, you'll be able to view it on my website. But again, thank you for joining us. And I'm going to jump right to the punchline. The whole idea of this is the biggest mistake leaders make. And in my opinion, it really boils down to one thing, and that is we don't slow down to speed up. We're trying to do too much. We're not managing our energy and those around us. We continue to do our old job, and we're not focused on what only we can do. Now, there's a really great article that's about 9 years old now, and it's entitled "What Only the CEO Can Do" by A.G. Lafley, and it was published in the Harvard Business Review. And he came up with 4 things that only the CEO can do, and I think these 4 things apply to all folks at the senior executive level. And I want you, as I read through these, to imagine what are the 4 things that only you can do in your position. So here's the 4 that only the CEO can do. Define and interpret the meaningful outside. So as we know, as organizations grow, people get more and more centered internally and focused on the internal, the culture, the drama. And it really is up to the CEO to get outside and verify that the vision, the values really match up to the market needs. So they're the ones that have to define and interpret the meaningful outside. The second one is answering time and time again the 2-part question. What business are we in? And what business are we not in? So it sounds like a pretty simple question, but I guarantee if you went around the table with your team and you said, what business are we in? And who's our customer? You'd find a lot of different answers. So it's important that the CEO really define what you're going to do and exactly what you're going to say no to. The third thing is balancing sufficient yield in the present with the necessary investment in the future. So this is really the balance of short-term and long-term. I think we can all relate to that. If you think about it, the operation, the execution, the day-to-day is the short-term. That keeps the wheels on. But the leader, the visionary, the CEO has to really think, is the day-to-day really getting us closer to the ultimate objective? And what are the things that we need to forsake today to build for tomorrow? And that's hard. And I can tell you, as a former CEO, that was the hardest part of my job, was maintaining that focus between the day-to-day and where we needed to go. Lastly, the 4th thing is shaping the values and standards of the organization. And standards is what might be thrown around these days as expectations. But I prefer the word standards because it's not about me, the leader, providing my personal expectations. It's about the standards of the organization. And it keeps the organization from seeping into mediocrity when we say, this is the standard. And, we have high standards here, and I know you can meet them. And when you do, you receive praise and recognition. And when you don't, somebody lets you know that you fell short. So I think that's really important. And as you can see from the picture, I think we can all relate to when you're speeding along a trail on a car, on a bike, whatever, is a much different perspective than when we slow down and take our time and walk. And you think about what you're doing at your organization. How often do we really slow down? Or are we so wrapped up in the activity that we miss things? So it really is slowing down to speed up. So I've got a laundry list of some other mistakes leaders make. So I think what I've covered is the big one, and that is, being wrapped up in activity, doing your old job, not managing your energy and those around you. But here's some others that you might be able to relate to. And as you look at them, think about not only the mistakes leaders are making, but the opposite of that are the things that we should be doing. So One, failing to delegate. I know this is probably familiar to a lot of you because, gosh, I can do it faster. It's going to take too long. It's not going to be up to the standard. There's a myriad of reasons we don't delegate, but when we don't delegate, we're doing our old job. We're not doing our new job. Next one, not setting goals. I can't tell you how many organizations I go into and people really don't know what's expected of them. Not leading with ideas and concepts and big picture. In the special ops community, a lot of people say, hey, whatever you think you can do 10 times. I don't know if that's really the number, but I do know that people want to pursue and be involved in big aspirational goals, things that are difficult. Other mistakes leaders make, the quick fixes, the Band-Aids, not really taking the time to understand what's the root cause of the problem. Poor communication. Think about this. I told them, we say that a lot, I told them what the values were. And it's easy to get in that rut and think, you just have to tell people once and you're good to go. But you have to tell people all the time, creatively and repetitively, where you're going, what's expected, what the standards are. And not only telling, but twice as much listening and seeking to make sure that it's really understood. One of my favorite lines is, tell me what you heard because I don't know what I said. So next one, resisting change. Hey, we tried that, it didn't work. And now that we have even a more diverse workplace, this is a major advantage for leaders that really understand how to tap into that. Another one is not making time for people. I've got plenty of examples where somebody will say, well, I scheduled 15 minutes a month with all my people. And I'm telling you, that's just not enough. Sometimes that scratches the surface. The best boss I ever had, I'll never forget one time we're planning like a 20-minute meeting and it ended up being 3 hours. He wiped off his calendar for everything that afternoon because I became a project. He needed to work with me on some things and I was being thick-headed. And to this day, those 3 hours was one of the greatest investments anyone ever made in me. So never underestimate how much people really value spending time with you. It's important. And it's a gift when you really give yourself to someone and you can focus and be present. Here's one that I spoke to a British woman about last week at Maxwell Air Force Base. And we had a whole discussion about making work fun. And she said, where she's at in England, at an academic institution, we can't have fun because we might offend someone. And I said, well, geez, in the United States, especially on the West Coast, if you don't make work fun, you're not going to have anybody to work with. So, it was an interesting thing because it's a fine line that we're walking these days as leaders is how do we make it fun? How do we make sure that we're not getting ourselves in a sticky situation? But I think the main thing is to talk about it, to talk about humor and what's appropriate and what's not, and make sure that you've got a place where people feel safe. Consequences. When people do great things, there should be praise and recognition. When people fail to do great things, there should be consequences. As simple as saying to someone, hey, you let the team down. That hurts when we hear that. Because most teams I found really do have a sense of duty to each other. And I think it's up to the leader to bring that out. Another one is managing morale. We could call it culture. We could call it whatever we want, but really having a sense of, what's going on out there. There's a Gallup 12, a series of 12 questions that you can ask a team to really understand whether they're engaged or not. And if you're not familiar with it, I would encourage you to look at that because you can get a baseline and establish that baseline and look at things on a quarterly or semi-annual basis to really know, is the team committed, engaged, not just merely compliant? MBWA versus LBSA. Managing by walking around or leading by storying around. So we all are familiar with managing by walking around and, how you doing? What are you working on? All that. That's important. But more and more leaders are understanding if they want to really create commitment and influence folks, they've got to be good at telling stories. They've got to be great at emotionally connecting to people. I did a little experiment with a group last year where I showed a slide of data and that company's values and goals. I showed them the slide. I put it up there and I read it for one part of the group. In another group, I told a story with no visual aid. Then I brought the two groups together and I told the group that saw the slide, what did they see? It was their values. It was their goals. It was their numbers. They couldn't remember anything. The group that heard the story with no visual aids retold the story perfectly. And it was to illustrate that we really have to figure out how we connect with people, and we have to tell stories. I mean, that's how history was passed down way before the written word. And it's a bonding experience. And I would encourage you to really become a student of storying around. We all know this one, fire slow. We keep people around way too long. There's a fellow on our podcast named Chris Warner, known as one of the 9 climbers who've done K2 and Everest. And he had a rule of 3. And that rule of 3 was if you spend more than 3 hours talking about a problem child, or more than 3 people complain about a problem child, it's time for that person to go. Now, I don't know if it was exactly 3 hours, but the whole point of it was don't belabor. If you know someone's not a fit, have those discussions, make sure they understand the standards and move along. Because what happens at first is the best players stop working with them. And then secondly, they quit and go to a team where the high standards are maintained. Second to last one is investing in personal development. I know of people that have been on military deployments and they have no idea what their boss thinks of them. And I know that happens in the business world. And what do we want more than anything is we want our boss to understand where we're at. We want to know how we're doing, and we want to know that there's a future. More and more of the young people I see quitting organizations today, the main thing I hear is, I didn't see a path. I didn't see a path here. And whether you're a small organization or a big organization, you can help people figure out what their path is, whether it's in your organization or out. But helping them get what they want is going to help you get what you want. Last one is is focusing on activity versus results. And my podcast co-host is fond of saying, busy is the new stupid. Busy is the new disease. There's a clip of Warren Buffett and Bill Gates, and Warren Buffett's really proud of the fact that when he shows his little calendar that's written down, not electronic, there's days where he has nothing on it. And he goes on to say, hey, I can buy anything in the world. The thing I cannot buy is time. So some interesting things. And again, think of the opposite of these as the things that we should be doing, of course. So some of you that are familiar with my work know that it's all about leading others, leading yourself, leading the organization. I've got these 3 pillars. One of the things that I talk about these days and what I hear is people saying, gosh, I want my team to take ownership. I want them to have shared accountability. I want those teams to be aligned within the organization. And again, it's leading self, it's leading others, it's leading the organization. But how do you cultivate grit? How do you foster duty? How do you set the pace? Well, my thinking with regard to these is pretty simple. When it comes to cultivating grit, I really do think it's about character and the 6 virtues that we've heard millions of times: courage, wisdom, justice, humanity, temperance, transcendence. And of course, the mother of all virtues, according to Aristotle, is courage. But that also has to be balanced with vigilance to be resourceful. And when we have people that are resourceful, they are going to take ownership and they're going to self-manage. And that is an expectation, a standard I think we should have. When we have that, when we have strong character, we're able to coach others, whether they're subordinate or peer or managing up. But coaching is something that we should all be doing on a team. And that comes from the confidence that we have in our ability to do our job, but also the humility to know that we may be wrong at times. And that really produces a lot more of a collaborative environment. On a recent Crucible, what we saw was when we had people where we designated leaders and roles were clear and we had a little bit of structure, the collaboration went up. When we had where there was ambiguity and people deferred to different people, we found collaboration wasn't as strong. Okay, so third pillar about leading the organization. I think this is all about setting pace. Oftentimes the direction is not debatable, but how we get there, the pace is. And I think that really goes down to it's a choice or a decision. And that's really balancing discipline and creativity or innovation to be focused. And one of the things that I see in organizations is there's ambiguity with regard to who can make the decision, what's the process, what's the criteria, what happens if I make a good decision, what happens if I make a bad decision. But if you think about it, if you don't talk about decisions, if you don't empower people, you're never going to have what's needed at the base, which is trust. That's the basis of a functional team, yet we hardly ever talk about who can make what decisions. And think of it this way. Think about the last time you had an expense report scrutinized. I mean, didn't it make you mad? Didn't you feel like they didn't trust you to make some decisions about where you spent money? Think about your organization and the culture and all those little signals it sends about how trust is built and maintained. And again, if you're leading the organization, you're able to set those policies in place that tells the team that they're trusted. But again, setting the pace is about managing energy, yours and those around you. You can't go 90 miles an hour for 90 days straight. Sometimes you go 90 miles an hour, sometimes you rest, sometimes you go 30. And I think great leaders know how to pace a team. So when you do step back, one of the lessons we can take from the military is the good old after action review. And that's really simple as basically saying, well, what was supposed to happen? What actually occurred? What went well and why? What should we sustain? And based on all that, what can be improved? So this picture is us in Alaska last summer. And, the team basically got to a part where they couldn't cross this. And there was a debate at this thing like, well, maybe we could just jump across. Well, that would have been really bad because as you can see, it's wide. And what ended up happening is the team basically went sort of downstream, if you will, and found a place where they could cross that was, really narrow. But when the team divided up into, they didn't communicate and basically say, well, hey, if we're not back in this amount of time and blah, 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 blah. So the after action review really provide an opportunity to make sure that we improve going forward our decision making. Well, again, think about your organization and what you do on a daily basis. How often are you taking a step back, slowing down and saying, what was supposed to happen? What happened? What have we learned that we need to improve? We had a pharmaceutical executive go on a Crucible once, and in 37 years of launching billion-dollar products, he said they never did an after-action review and said, well, what did we learn from the last campaign? What do we need to do differently? Pretty amazing. So this whole idea, and I'm getting ready to wrap here, is systems thinking. And that is looking at the really big picture and really trying to figure out what's the root cause. And it really does go back to structure, process, systems, incentives, and people. And if we create a great environment, people are going to do the right thing most of the time with minimal supervision. And that goes back to the biggest mistake leaders make is if they're running and gunning and going 90 miles an hour, they're going to miss the root cause. They're going to miss the big picture perspective. Last story, engineer lieutenant in the Army a long time ago was down in the mud building a bridge with his team. And a colonel came up and said, come here. Took him up the hill, sat under a tree, started smoking a cigar, didn't say a word. Lieutenant was getting itchy, thinking, my men are going to think I'm a slacker. I'm not down there in the mud, working with them. I'm up here in the shade. Bunch of time went by. Colonel didn't say anything. And then finally, Lieutenant looked and went, oh my God, we should have. And the colonel went, exactly. In other words, they put their bridge in the wrong spot. And the lieutenant wouldn't have realized that if he didn't have a bigger picture, if he didn't take a step back. But he was in the work, and instead of being the coach, he was a player. And tell me the last time you've seen a coach in the NFL go on the field and play a play. It doesn't happen. Yet in the business world, we do it all the time. So with that, I'll be glad to take any questions. I also want to let you know we're starting a Crucible Mastermind March 1st. And this is 1 hour a month, and we're going to have all kinds of other things. But it's a way for people to come together and at a very minimal cost, $50 a month or $250 for 6 months. And we're going to get a whole bunch of people together, like-minded people like the folks that are on this podcast. And it's it's really a peer advisory group. So if you're interested in that, I'll send you the link to sign up after this podcast. But in the meantime, let me go ahead and stop sharing my screen and see if anybody has any questions. I'll just make sure you unmute your mic and be glad to take any questions you've got. All right. Well, I did promise I'd be a 20-minute webinar. We're about 22. So again, everybody, I really appreciate you joining me today. Like I said, we'll record this. We'll put it out on my site. And again, if you have any questions, just shoot me back an email. I'll get this link to you. And thank you again. Have a great long weekend. Bye-bye.